Because of course, if you're gonna go to like a J-pop concert, you should dress accordingly. And we had a fantastic time. It was an amazing show. And I just, ever since, I mean, even before then, but even more so since then, because she loves J-pop slam metal, I was like, I would give my life for this woman. So, please, and she's gonna read something amazing, I have no doubt. Please give it up for our next reader, Miss Whitney Hamrick. Such a badass.
The shirt I wore said that anything you can do, I can do bleeding.
Oh. Jesus, that's good.
Yeah, kid show.
Yeah.
So everything sucks and it's sad. But on the 21st, Mayor Bunny Dyer signed a provision saying that ghost kitchens are going to be a thing. And if you don't know what a ghost kitchen is, I'll tell you because I just found out. It is a to-go only restaurant. So it's going to be like fully cultivated menus, but you can only go by ordering out, which is cool. But at first, I misunderstood what that meant. And I was like, what if there was a ghost kitchen? That's fucking cute. I'm right about that. So guess what it's called? It's called Ghost Kitchen. Ready? I'm not clever with titles. The last time my grandmother had her children and grandchildren over for dinner felt like the peak of her life. Like the mechanisms of her internal clock clicked into her final years and she could breathe differently, freed from worry, knowing at that moment we would be fine. My grandmother died some years later. When dementia took our names, she forgot us and then herself. But I remember that last dinner in particular, since it was the night she pulled out an old shoebox full of black and white photos from under her bed. A pot-bellied pig with a big show ribbon looking smug, smiling children piled on a pouting workhorse, the old gray dog that convinced the barn cats to lay across him as his winter blanket, dressed in her Sunday best. One of my preteen great aunts jumped into the river by the covered bridge. My long since deceased uncle stood by a shining brand new car in the driveway. Both young, my grandmother and grandfather, Justine and Jean, stood before their first house in Jacksonville after their big move from West Virginia. I wore my favorite blue dress for that picture, my grandmother said, leaning over my shoulder to see what had me so enamored. By the time we said our goodbyes with tight and easy hugs, I had picked the pig, the dog, and the preteen great aunt. We all fought over our grandmother in her blue dress, but when I took out my photos at home, I noticed she had snuck it into my stack. 20 some odd years later, I held that photo in my hand as I walked towards the Orlando Ghost Kitchen, one of the many programs throughout the country to help the recently returned, dearly departed feel useful. Mm-hmm. When the phenomenon hit the world, not everyone's loved ones pulled through. The famous and the average citizen fared equally in the somewhat random occurrence of ghosts appearing back on Earth. Marilyn Monroe couldn't sing or dance, but she has run the best photo booth just fine in some Saskatchewan mall for the past 6 months. Gandhi seemed to have a great time handling the controls at a Coney Island ride for a week. Of all people, in all places, Saddam Hussein started making popcorn at a movie theater in Minnesota. So far, as we know, those who are granted the second life aren't selected based on virtue. There is no indication of the rapture, purgatory, circle of hell punishment, or unfinished business. The ghosts' previous occupations or notoriety rarely had anything to do with their return. And just yesterday, the news reported a Byzantine nun works the cash register at a strip club in Wisconsin. Jesus of Nazareth is a ski instructor in Switzerland. Deep Throat walks dogs in Paris. Ruth Bader Ginsburg feeds stray cats in Nanchang. Abraham Lincoln just wants to garden in Johannesburg, and the rest of us can fuck off. Besides the ones that hit the news, it's not easy to find out whether your loved one came back at all. If your dead relative shows up in Budapest, there's little to no way to find out. If you did, there's no way to know how long they will remain. Some stay for hours and others weeks or months. Maybe it'll show up on Reddit. Sometimes though, rarely, the dead return somewhere close enough to see them in person. The other day, while I walked along Mills Avenue to meet up with some friends, I lifted my arm to brush back strands of hair blowing in my face when a loose page of the Sentinel flapped in the wind, wrapped around my arm. In the fold, I saw the name Justina Hamrick. The article announced the Orlando Ghost Kitchen and my grandmother would be there. As I stood in line clutching a photo of my grandparents, I edged closer and closer to the window, my heart pounding. There she stood, youthful in her blue dress and tight apron, making biscuit dough and canning preserved food. Her carefully constructed perm of curls and her short updo, her strong shoulders and arms working dough on a marble island in the kitchen, she smiled like her sense of humor never left, like the joy of baking meant her family would be fed. A woman wailed beside me as I crossed the threshold, joy and heartache. Her mother stood by the cake display. The mother was known for her cakes, and she smiled like the ones for sale were the best she'd ever made. This woman, her daughter, drove all night after work to make it here in time, just in case her time was limited. A daughter, with her raised voice, told the ghost how much she was missed and loved, and the ghost stared politely and asked which cake the daughter, a customer, wanted. The daughter bought them all before she left. I stood there for hours watching my grandmother. I cried. My feet rooted to the floor, begging to stretch beneath the tile and reach her deeply. The old steel pressure cooker filled with canning jars whistled as she whipped around to let out the steam and extract the green beans, blackberry jam, and apple butter, which she set aside to cool just in time for the fresh sheets of biscuits to come out of the oven. Rows and rows of her preserved food stood on the shelves above her, all for sale, as she worked with the perfectly timed efficiency I remembered. When the door sign flipped closed, my grandmother handed me a to-go container filled with biscuits and a side of apple butter. I don't know how much engagement these ghosts really had on the rest of the world, but she hugged me as best as she poorly could and disappeared. I went home stunned and miserable. I wish I had yelled like the daughter before me. I wish I had told her that I loved her and I missed her. At my small kitchenette, I opened the box. On the inside of the lid, my grandmother had written the names of our family: her parents, brother, sister, wives and husbands, children, nieces, nephews, grandchildren, and even the great-grandchildren she didn't live to meet. She remembered us and watched over us all. When I went back to the ghost kitchen, my grandmother was gone. For good this time. Thank you.